They were two promising young employees at a luxury hotel.
Both were excellent members of staff. They were known as punctual, good, solid, hard-working people.
Until they were both slain under mysterious circumstances.
They were met with a horrific scene, possibly some form of bizarre, ritualistic behaviour.
That indicated a lot of anger, a lot of passion. This wasn't just some random attack.
The search for their killer would lead investigators down a dark and disturbing path.
He just had this sort of anger festering inside him that was just ready to erupt at any moment.
But the more clues they uncover, the more bizarre the case becomes.
This must have just been so baffling for the investigators.
I've never seen anything like it in 14 years of dealing with murder.
August 10th, 2011, London, England. Around 3:15 p.m., managers at the Radisson Blu Edwardian Hotel outside Heathrow Airport call police after 3 of their employees go missing.
They were due to start a shift at 3 p.m. and they didn't show up. And that was very out of character for them. So the time went by and people began to get more and more worried.
The hotel staff had obviously trying to reach them by phone. Tried and tried and tried, to no avail.
When officers get there, they're told that 2 of the employees live in staff apartments behind the hotel. So that's where they start.
The officers enter, not knowing what they're about to discover.
They found what was essentially a bloodbath.
On the floor is the dead body of a young woman.
She'd been subjected to a horrendous stabbing attack.
They also noticed a trail of blood leading to the back bedroom. Now, when they go in there, they find another victim. The body of a young man, naked, laid out on the bed. It appears he's also been stabbed.
The victims are identified as 2 of the 3 missing employees. 20-year-old receptionists, Tibor Voss and Alice Adams.
It's not just horrifying, it's unimaginable. I mean, this just isn't the sort of place where something like this happens.
Tibor Voss was born and raised in Budapest, Hungary, and although he came from humble beginnings, he had big dreams.
He came from a fairly poor background, but he was quite bright. I mean, he was a prodigious musician. He could play pretty much every instrument he turned his hand to.
His favourite instrument seems to have been the piano, which had been a gift from his grandmother.
It was 100 years old, and apparently this was something he played regularly and often and was very good at.
But in 2006, at the age of 15, Tibor's life changed forever when his father suddenly died.
Tibor certainly took on the role of the father figure, but due to his young age, his mother did struggle to make ends meet and pay for the family to live in Hungary.
Tibor was doing everything he could to improve his family's fortunes. He'd applied to the University of Budapest in 2008, but unfortunately he'd been turned down.
He was planning to apply to university the next year to have a second go.
In the meantime, Tibor decided to move to London to find work.
I think London offered him a fresh start in a big city somewhere in Europe. He could come to the UK, he could earn a bit more money than he could earn at home.
And in August of 2010, 19-year-old Tibor got his big break.
He had managed to get a job at the Radisson Edwardian Hotel, which is a stone's throw from Heathrow Airport.
It was where, travellers would stay or business people would stop in before going to the airport.
It seemed Tibor really loved his job, and he quickly made friends with all of the staff. It seemed like everybody loved him.
By all accounts, he sort of threw himself into his work. He was very good at it. He was well respected as a colleague.
One of the friends Tibor made was 20-year-old Alice Adams.
Alice was a local girl who lived with her family in Buckinghamshire. It seemed that she and Tibor bonded over their love for music.
She had an arts background, played musical instruments, played the guitar, and was a very entertaining personality.
Alice was working at the hotel to save up to take a trip of a lifetime.
Alice's aunt was due to get married later that month in Hawaii.
Her sisters were going, her mum was going. It was all booked and ready to go, and she was extremely excited.
Everybody had been rather infected by her enthusiasm since she'd arrived.
She was gregarious and funny, and certainly well liked among the staff at the hotel, and guests seemed to take to her as well.
Tibor and Alice quickly became integral members of the hotel staff. But as much as he enjoyed London, Tibor was determined to return to Budapest and help his family.
He reapplied to the University of Budapest that next year, and this time he got in.
He was going home to sort of pursue that academic dream.
Tibor was scheduled to leave on August 30th, 2011, but the long-anticipated family reunion would never happen. Instead, just 3 weeks before he was supposed to leave, Tibor and Alice have both been found murdered, and police have no idea why.
They were young, they were vibrant, and the scene was as baffling as it was gruesome.
There was a murderer who was prepared to kill 2 people at one time at large.
Coming up, the crime scene reveals some disturbing clues.
It was an excruciatingly violent death that those victims had suffered.
Possibly some form of bizarre, ritualistic behaviour.
London police are investigating the brutal murders of 2 hotel employees, 20-year-old Tibor Voss and his friend Alice Adams.
3 of the workers down for the 3 p.m. shift did not turn up. So eventually the police were called and kicked in the door.
They'd been found stabbed to death in Tibor's apartment behind the hotel when they'd failed to show up for work. They're not only looking at 2 extremely violent murders, but a missing person as well.
The first thing the police do is to seal the premises off, effectively, to restrict anybody else having access.
When homicide detectives arrive, they bring a full forensic team with them to go over the crime scene, looking for evidence.
You're trying to get a picture of what you're dealing with, you know. Who are they? What are they doing there?
There are no signs of the 3rd missing employee. There's also no sign of forced entry, and it doesn't look like anything was stolen. In fact, it appears there had been a wild party going on the night before.
There was evidence of alcohol consumption, and there was some drug paraphernalia around the flat.
Police found the remnants of poppers, which are essentially a sort of mood-loosening drug that you sniff. They tend to sort of diminish inhibitions.
Investigators don't yet know if the drugs have anything to do with the murders, but it seems possible, given the extreme violence involved.
There were 22 stab wounds to her, both to the front and the back.
That indicated a lot of anger, a lot of passion, and that tells detectives this wasn't just some random attack. Whoever did this likely knew Alice, and the position they found her body in strengthened that assumption.
She was covered with blood, and her face was covered with a cushion.
It could be that whoever killed her didn't want to see what he'd done, or perhaps if her eyes were open, he felt unnerved by that. It's very difficult to know.
When investigators began examining Tibor's body, the crime scene becomes even more disturbing.
Tibor was on his back on the bed with his knees, legs slightly raised, hands by his side.
It was like he'd been placed like a mannequin in a shop or something.
The pathologist determined that Tibor had been stabbed twice in the heart, but he wasn't on the bed when it happened.
He was naked. He'd sustained fatal stab wounds. You would expect to see a lot of blood on and around the body, but in this particular case, Tibor's body was very clean.
They realised that, in fact, to some extent, his body had been washed. They were able to see that there was diluted blood on his body.
Based on the evidence, detectives believe Tibor was stabbed on the sofa, then moved afterwards.
There was a small mark at the small of his back, which was clear he'd been dragged on an abrasive surface.
The body had been moved and put into position, but they had no idea why.
In my experience, it's very, very unusual. I can only suggest that it's possibly some form of bizarre, ritualistic behaviour by the killer.
Further examination reveals several other strange details.
Both victims had been attacked with a knife, but there weren't any defensive wounds. Alice had a cut on her arm, but you'd expect there to be more evidence if someone was trying to stop someone stabbing them to death.
But, I mean, that was one of the strangest things. So it was either they'd been caught unaware or perhaps they'd been sort of stupefied by the drugs and the alcohol that they'd taken.
That, combined with the fact that detectives couldn't find any trace of the killer in the apartment, meant this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment attack. Somebody planned this.
There was all this blood inside the threshold and everywhere, but there was no blood outside at all, which one would expect to find if someone heavily bloodstained had left the scene.
As deliberate as the killer seemed to have been, they hadn't even tried to get rid of the murder weapon.
On initial examination of the crime scene, several bloodstained knives were found within the flat.
On the one hand, you've got the injuries to Alice, which suggest a crime of passion, but on the other hand, you've got what happened to Tibor, which were almost sort of cold and calculating in nature.
This was quite clearly not a normal murder case. Even experienced detectives were looking at this scene and wondering what on earth was going on.
The hotel's security footage doesn't provide any leads either. So detectives turned to Tibor and Alice's co-workers, hoping they might be able to shed some light on what happened.
They got glowing reports on both Alice and Tibor. Both were excellent members of staff. They were known as punctual, good, solid, hard-working people.
Police learned that Alice had only been working there for a few weeks. She and Tibor were really close, but it wasn't a romantic thing. They just had lots in common.
Employees say the party at Tibor's apartment was to celebrate him finally getting into college.
We were told that the party was because Tibor Vass was due to go back to Hungary, so a celebration of sorts, or a going-away party.
He was leaving London and returning home, something that he was very happy about.
The colleagues had been with, in fact, Tibor and Alice. They were drinking. Alice played the guitar. There was singing, and they'd obviously had a good evening.
When it was time to go home, the only people left in Tibor's apartment with him were Alice and his roommate, 31-year-old Attila Ban.
That's the first they've heard of a roommate, but Attila isn't just living with Tibor, he's also a manager at the hotel. And he's the third missing employee.
They didn't know whether he was a victim, being kidnapped himself, or was a party to what had taken place.
Coming up, the search for Tibor's roommate turns up a possible motive.
Some speculated that it might be some sort of revenge killing.
A bizarre crime scene at a 5-star hotel in London has left detectives guessing. 2 employees have been murdered, and a third has gone missing. But is he another potential victim or a suspect?
We had learned from witnesses and colleagues that Attila Ban was nowhere to be found. Urgent inquiries were then undertaken to trace him.
They try calling his cell phone. Now, there's no answer, but it does let detectives see where the phone is currently located.
They could see it was pinging off a cell tower in the area near the hotel, but they just couldn't work out where he was. There was no sign of him. He was there, but he wasn't there. It was very odd.
In the meantime, investigators continue to interview other staff members at the hotel, hoping to learn more about Attila and his relationship with Tibor and Alice.
Attila Ban was from Hungary, like Tibor. But according to those who knew him, Attila's upbringing was very different.
He had an abusive childhood and then was brought up by his grandparents.
Things didn't get any easier for Attila as he got older.
He was homosexual. He realised that when he was aged about 17 and found that very difficult in Hungary.
He struggled to cope with the fact that he was gay. And in a country where that's not necessarily approved of.
Attila faced an uphill battle living in Hungary, so he decided to make a change.
He was clearly bright. He travelled to the United States and worked there for a while when he was aged about 25. Found life rather more tolerant there about his sexuality.
It seems Attila did fairly well in the States. He got some valuable work experience. But after a while, he decided to move again.
He came to London to better himself and try and get a career in the hotel business.
He had a history of working in the hospitality industry. He'd held similar jobs in the US.
He'd come over to the UK, first of all, to visit, but then had managed to get a job working at the Radisson Hotel.
Attila excelled at the Radisson, quickly becoming one of their most valued staff members.
He was a very successful employee. He was gregarious, outgoing, confident.
Customers were very, very quick to praise him. In fact, we never heard anything negative about Attila Ban at all.
As a reward, the hotel gave him one of their exclusive staff apartments to live in.
There were only a few of these, so it was deemed quite a step up to be offered one of these apartments.
That same year, Tibor Voss came to work as a receptionist. It didn't take long for the two to become friends.
I think Attila had recognised a fellow Hungarian who he could bond with.
Tibor was 20, Attila was 31. So Tibor probably thought of him as an older brother, someone he could look up to.
Attila Ban took Tibor under his wing and nurtured him at work and was clearly very impressed with Tibor and saw him as a kindred spirit.
Attila provided Tibor with valuable guidance, as well as a place to live.
Tibor was living in sort of dingy, rented accommodation, and when he sort of expressed the fact that he didn't like this, Attila had asked him to move in.
There'd been no secret about Attila's sexuality. And no suggestion that Tibor was homosexual either. And he was perfectly happy to share the flat with him. He was an older man, they came from the same country.
When Alice started working at the hotel, Attila was the one who showed her the ropes as well, and he was the one who introduced her to Tibor, and they all became good friends.
Now Attila has gone missing, and since witnesses place him at the crime scene, he seems to be the most logical suspect. Or he would be if investigators could come up with a motive.
He got on well with both these people. Both were charming, pleasant, young colleagues, and there was no apparent reason why they should have been killed.
Detectives still didn't know what to make of the strange, ritualistic way in which Tibor had been killed, so they decided to focus on Alice first.
Police would have thought that Alice was the target. I mean, it seemed that the rage had been directed against her.
When detectives take a look at Alice's cell phone records, they make an interesting discovery.
Analysis of Alice's mobile phone revealed a series of texts that had taken place on the night she died during the small hours of the morning.
She had been in contact with a former boyfriend of hers, Tad.
From what investigators were able to find out, the two had been together for a while, but only recently broken up.
He'd moved away to a different part of the UK to university, and so they were on and off again.
It had just been rekindled again at around about this time.
The records also showed that he and Alice had been in contact on the night of the murders.
They were apparently texting while she was at the party, and one of those messages really stood out to detectives.
She said she was in bed with her manager, Attila, and she'd also texted that Tibor was throwing up and drunk.
Investigators don't know much about their relationship at this point, but most boyfriends aren't going to be too happy with their girlfriends texting that they're in bed with another guy.
Did Alice's boyfriend show up at the apartment to take revenge?
With the phone conversations, he could have been jealous.
So maybe he drives over there, kills Alice and Tibor, and kidnaps Attila. For all they know, he could already be dead.
Coming up, a social media post takes the case in a new direction.
It was very mysterious. It just said simply, "I'd like to wake up from this nightmare."
Hours after Tibor Voss and Alice Adams were found stabbed to death in his apartment, London police have a suspect. Alice's former boyfriend, Tad Finney.
The boyfriend is obviously the suspect you would look at first of all. She'd been on the phone to him a few times throughout the evening, I think once even to say that she was in bed with her manager Attila.
However, lab tests from the evidence found in the apartment seem to indicate there was more going on than just a simple tryst.
Tibor and Attila's DNA was present on Alice, and also Attila Band's DNA was present on Tibor, obviously at this party. Some sexual activity had clearly taken place.
There's no real evidence to suggest that they'd partied together in this way before.
Did seeing his girlfriend involved in a threesome cause Tad to fly into a jealous rage? Investigators track him down to find out.
He didn't come across as a cold-blooded killer. He was very distraught and said he'd been at home the whole night after talking to Alice.
He was able to provide an alibi of sorts. The last text between them was around 3:30 in the morning, so what that showed to us was that Tad Finney's phone had been at his address.
Of course, that by itself doesn't necessarily prove that he's telling the truth, or that he had his phone with him. So they decided to follow up with a search warrant.
We checked his clothing for any signs of blood distribution or any suggestion that he could have been at the crime scene when the killings took place.
It became clear that he was nowhere near the scene and Tad couldn't have been responsible for the murders.
But if he didn't do it, who did?
As investigators are following up on this lead, they come across new information from one of the victim's co-workers.
A colleague from the hotel made police aware of a Facebook post from Attila Ban.
At about 7:30 that morning, there'd been a posting saying, "I'd like to wake up from this nightmare."
This appeared to be an odd sentence to use. It was apparently entirely out of character. This post, with its potentially sinister connotation, didn't make sense.
The cryptic message does tell investigators one thing, however.
It confirmed to us that Attila Ban was clearly alive, but what we didn't know was where he was.
And if Attila's not a victim, there's only one other alternative.
It became clear that Attila Ban was a suspect, and they needed to find him as soon as they could to find out what had happened.
Detectives return to the hotel to speak with Attila's friends. And this time, they discover there's more to this employee of the year than meets the eye.
People seem to be a little hesitant to talk about it at first, but it seemed the rumor was that Attila liked Tibor a little bit too much, that he had a major crush on him.
Their co-workers say that Attila was well aware that Tibor wasn't gay, but he might have been hoping to change his mind.
Attila managed to arrange his rosters so that they would work together, they would finish work together. He arranged them to share the same flat.
As they spent more time together, the relationship grew, and so did Attila's feelings for Tibor.
Attila Ban was what I would describe as infatuated, almost obsessed with Tibor.
The problem was that it just wasn't reciprocated. Tibor was not interested. He was interested in women.
In the months leading up to the murders, Tibor and Attila's friendship started to suffer.
Tibor didn't appreciate all that he was doing for him in supporting him at work and really taking him under his wing.
There were frequent quarrels when he thought Tibor had sort of slighted him by leaving him out of a conversation or a social situation.
Colleagues say that on one occasion, they even saw the two men get into a heated argument.
Tibor had arranged for a star photograph to be taken, and on the day it was taken, Attila was not in the photograph.
He was left out of this photo, and Attila was not happy about that at all.
And things only seemed to get worse once Tibor started becoming closer with Alice.
Attila was upset about that, clearly jealous of anybody else having a relationship with Tibor.
He wanted Tibor to be spending time with him. He'd got in the flat. Why was he off with this woman who just waltzed in there and had only been at the hotel a few weeks?
Had it been enough to finally cause Attila to snap?
He had just had this sort of anger festering inside him that was just ready to sort of erupt at any moment.
And the whole thing was compounded by Tibor's intention to leave the UK. This is what we believe is motivation for the killings.
With Alice's boyfriend cleared of suspicion, Attila Ban has become the prime suspect. There's just one problem.
We were still left with the indisputable fact. We just didn't know where he was.
Not only do they not know where he is, they have no idea how he managed to flee the scene without anybody seeing him.
There were a number of theories that police worked up, that maybe he was in the loft, maybe he jumped out of a window, or maybe he'd been particularly cold and calculating and stashed a clean pair of shoes outside the front door so he could have put them on after the killing, made his getaway without leaving a telltale trail of blood.
We checked to see if there was any loft space or a crawl space or an adjoining property that may be linked that had some form of fire escape or escape route, but all to no avail.
The trail had gone cold, but the forensics team went back to the room to check it out again.
Coming up, investigators make a shocking discovery.
This is just a scene that nobody could ever have imagined or envisaged.
It must just have been mind-blowing.
It has been 2 days since the investigation into the murders of Tibor Voss and Alice Adams began. Detectives have narrowed the list of suspects down to one: Tibor's jealous roommate, Attila Ban. But he is nowhere to be found.
It was as if he'd vanished into thin air.
Hoping to find new leads, London police return to the crime scene. But as soon as they arrive, detectives immediately notice something is wrong.
So the police went back for another look to see what they might have missed at the scene. They saw that the door to the bedroom in the flat that had been left open, it was now closed.
It was very apparent that things had been moved around. A bottle of vodka had been moved, medication had been moved.
It could have absolutely meant that someone had broken into a crime scene, and that was probably their biggest fear.
Their first thought is that maybe somebody had broken in to tamper with the evidence. But when they get to the back bedroom, they find the last thing anybody could have expected.
My colleagues then went to push the door, and there was a heavy weight behind it. The bed had been pushed against the door.
Sort of forced their way into the bedroom, and just out of the blue there is Attila.
Investigators find their murder suspect lying face down on the bed.
He has appeared to be in a semi-comatose or drunken and confused state.
There are cuts to his wrist and on his throat, apparently in an attempt to commit suicide.
He was found with a number of superficial injuries, but these were only minor grazes.
He's caked in blood, with a craft knife sticking out of his arm and another one in his buttocks.
Once the officers realised that the man in the crime scene was indeed our prime suspect, Attila Ban, he was arrested straight away. But due to his injuries, he was taken straight to hospital.
But with the crime scene sealed off for the past 2 days, how could he have gotten in?
This must have just been so baffling for the investigators. So obviously they take another look at the crime scene and wonder where on earth he's appeared from in his naked form. So they pull the crime scene apart.
The mystery stumps investigators until one of them notices a small detail in the bedroom.
Looking at the sheets and the blood on it, they realised that there'd been a cut in the side of the divan bed. They lifted the bed up.
They find a space there just large enough for one person, and they realise that Attila didn't break in. He's been there the whole time.
Attila has essentially carved a hole in the divan underneath the bed and has been hiding there since the murder.
This is the same bed on which Tibor Vass's body had been found.
He had never left the premises at all, and whilst the investigators had been in the premises, he'd been hiding under the bed.
Police are dumbfounded. The entire time they were conducting their investigation, the killer had been right under their noses.
He'd cut out a section of the divan, almost as eye holes, if you like, in order to peer out and see what was happening. In my 14 years of dealing with murder investigations, I'd never seen anything of the like. I mean, it's crazy.
But he'd actually taken this primitive survival kit inside this. There's a bottle of water, a knife, and his mobile phone to keep him going in there.
But it seemed 2 days were as long as Attila could make it. After he's treated and released from the hospital, investigators sit down with Attila to find out what happened. Unfortunately, he's not talking.
The officers interviewing Ban were quite surprised to find that he said absolutely nothing. It was almost as if he'd been struck mute.
Detectives aren't sure whether this is just another deception or an indication of his mental state.
He just murdered his 2 closest friends, so it's possible he might have had some kind of psychotic breakdown, but at that point, there is no question that he did it.
Attila Ban was eventually charged with the 2 murders of Tibor Vass and Alice Adams, and up to that point, he continued to say nothing.
Attila kept his silence up for several weeks before he finally comes clean about what happened the night of the murders.
He tells them about the party for Tibor and how it was supposed to be a special party for him, and it appears Attila brought along some drugs just to spice up the celebration.
He explained about his offering poppers for people there and the taking of other drugs to party and to drink.
Attila claims he can't remember anything after that.
He portrayed an amnesia, a lack of recollection as to what had happened precisely.
He said he sort of woke up out of a stupor and there were the bodies, and so he figured he must have killed them, but he had no recollection of doing so.
It was their and my view that Attila Ban was suffering from a severe case of selective memory.
Coming up, Attila Ban faces trial for the murders of Tibor Vass and Alice Adams.
He tries to claim that he wasn't in a fit mental state when he murdered them.
But will the jury believe him?
Attila Ban was an extremely devious and manipulative individual.
On July 9th, 2012, nearly a year after the murders of Tibor Vass and Alice Adams, Attila Ban finally stands trial.
Attila Ban pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility,
which meant that he shouldn't be held fully responsible for the killings.
But prosecutors think otherwise. They paint Attila as a man who was obsessed with his roommate and became enraged when his affections were not returned.
Tibor and Alice being such close friends, Tibor intending to leave the UK, coupled with Attila's almost obsessional pursuit of Tibor, all added to Attila's frustration.
All this anger and jealousy had been building and building for some time.
Prosecutors believe that on the night in question, Attila's desire for Tibor was finally realized in a drug-fueled sexual encounter. But it hadn't turned out the way he'd hoped.
Tibor had shown sort of more affection towards Alice. This had driven Attila mad.
Attila had that moment of realization that he's always going to prefer contact with women to me.
When Attila finally realized he would never have Tibor to himself, he snapped.
Attila felt that if he couldn't have Tibor, then nobody could.
Since neither of the victims had defensive wounds, prosecutors think that he might have waited until they passed out and then stabbed both of them.
One of the unsolved mysteries in this case was quite what had happened and in what order. It's very difficult to work out.
Prosecutors don't know why Attila took the time to clean and pose Tibor's body afterward, but it showed that he was clearly aware of what he had done.
I can't really give an opinion on why such an event may have taken place, what it may have meant, or why it may have happened.
As twisted as it might sound, it might have been Attila's way of paying last respects to the man he loved.
Attila's defense argues that his actions were consistent with a man who was suffering a severe mental breakdown.
They even put Attila on the stand to testify in his own defense, but that proved to be a mistake.
In giving evidence, Attila Ban rather kept a script, accepted he must have killed both Alice and Tibor. But he couldn't give any rational explanation really as to why he would have behaved quite as he did.
He wound up essentially bursting into tears, trying to convince the jury that there was no way that he could have done something like this in his right mind to his best friends.
I mean, he put on something of a theatrical show, really. He was very sort of over the top, putting on this show for the jury of being disorientated and not really understanding what was going on.
To the prosecution, Attila's claims of mental illness are just another ruse.
You would not be able to hold down a responsible job. So he was functioning, he was going out, he was working.
Attila Ban was an extremely devious and manipulative individual. And the fact that he was suffering from a mental illness, unfortunately, appears to be disproved when you consider that he had the presence of mind and the resourcefulness to secrete himself within the crime scene, and also to make provision within the confines of the divan bed to take water and other articles with him, in effect, as a hideout.
Even if there'd been a loss of control, I mean, a real loss of control, provoked by something that had happened, that would only apply to one of them.
The jury agrees. On July 18, 2012, they find Attila Ban guilty on all counts.
The jury convicted Attila Ban of the 2 counts of murder that he faced. 1 count for Alice and 1 count for Tibor.
I believe the jury thought, as I do, that Attila Ban was an extremely devious and manipulative individual.
He was sentenced to a life in prison and will serve a minimum of 26 years. It must have provided some comfort to see him pay for what he did, but nothing can undo the pain he caused.
A disturbed man's jealousy had ended 2 promising young lives and shattered the lives of their families forever.
I've never encountered a case like that, ever, and I doubt I will ever encounter a case like that again.
This is one of the most tragic cases I've ever had to deal with. Tibor Vass and Alice Adams, who were effectively cut down in their prime with their whole lives before them, is some obsessive desire that couldn't be satisfied. But why Alice had to die, I'll never understand it.